Thank you so much to everyone for coming today to Luke's talk, and especially at this time of year, and especially the year being what it has been so far. So I respectfully acknowledge the Wurundjeri, the Wadawurrung, and the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nations, and the Gunditjmara Mara people as the traditional owners of the lands on which Deakin University's Burwood, Geelong, Melbourne, as well as Warrnambool campuses stand. And I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge that sovereignty over these lands was never ceded. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge what a tiring and demoralizing time it has been for so many of our colleagues, and really the community as a collective. So really wanted to acknowledge that, and really I wanted to acknowledge the time that everyone's taken, and Dr. Luke Heemsbergen specifically in coming to this talk, and to Luke for putting this talk together, especially at this time of year. So I'm not going to spend too much time describing this book, because that's Luke's going to do that. Where the book's titled Radical Transparency and Digital Democracy, Wikileaks and Beyond. And congratulations, Luke. This book was just published a few months ago by the Emerald Publishing Group. And it is very briefly the story of radical transparency in a datafied world, which sounds absolutely interesting and intriguing to me. So without further ado, over to you, Luke. Thank you so much again.
Well, thank you very much. And I mirror those concerns, and thanks for just what you've said. I think the first time we talked, this talk was supposed to happen in August, and for all the reasons you just mentioned, it certainly did not. So I appreciate your patience, and I can't say the research has progressed much since that, but here we are. So thank you for the introduction, the opportunity to speak about, radical transparency and digital democracy. So I am interested in radical transparency and democracy. As such, I think it's important that we start by describing my working definition of radical transparency. And I see three dimensions to radical transparency. The first is process, radical process, and this signals radical processes of disclosure, that is media that enable new types of information to be disclosed and accessed in new ways. The second dimension signals radical positions to disclosure. So that is disclosure action by organizations that sit outside of what is being disclosed. It's not organizations, right, being transparent themselves. And the third dimension is a bit trickier. It signals a radical politics that uproot current expectations of democratic governing. These politics change what is expected from those that govern. And a great example of what I'm trying to describe here that caught my eye years ago was actually a crime map that was put out by the Spatial Information Lab at Columbia. Now, large data sets of crime-related incidents can be geospatially mapped, right? And usually this means, you get a form of transparency that shows you within a city or a country where muggings occur or murders, et cetera, right? It's a heat map that shows, that warns citizens, I should say, that warns citizens where they are unsafe and shows states where they need to escalate police presence. Now, the map that caught my interest wasn't that kind of map. It was this piece of radical transparency that instead mapped the cost of extraditing people from their neighborhoods and then incarcerating them. It shows block by block, block by block, the extent to which the state renders humans and capital from neighborhoods and pushes it to the prison industrial complex. It's a simple visualization that uproots how we understand crime to affect communities and what we expect our institutions to do about it. So this is kind of just a key moment where I thought, wow, we can talk about transparency in a really different way. And I just want to note here for clarity that the transparency I'm speaking about today is targeted towards organizations or institutions that govern, not individuals with little or no power. So my working definition of radical transparency then has to do with process, right? The media, radical position, the organizational position, and the politics that engenders. Now, to build an adequate prism to kind of interrogate this idea of radical transparency, I wanted to think about how instances of radical transparency come together as social technological apparatuses that afford new and unique forms of governing. So what I did is I tried to synthesize research from classical government transparency studies, media studies, right, and then governmentality studies. So in the transparency sense, I was looking at people's work like Hood and Hild and Mikhail Flyverbaum. For media study, I was interested in kind of the material turn, and I'll go into my media theory in a second. But from the governmentality side, the study of government, I was interested in the critical assessments of radical democracy or agonistic democracy, agonism. People like Sullivan, Helen Sullivan, and Griggs et al. And it's kind of just the trajectory that comes from Chantal Mouffe, right? So we can talk about that more if we want. But anyways, all this kind of came together towards a prism that allowed me to say that, well, I argue that radical transparency has the power to determine and reframe fundamental democratic questions. Who gets to know what, how they come to do so, and how that shifts expectations of the conduct of conduct. So the expectations of the conduct of conduct. That is to say, it mediates new ways of knowing publicly and acting politically, right? It mediates new ways of knowing publicly and acting politically. So that's all nice to know what's in the book. Here's the 7 chapters, yeah. And as you note, we are on slide 5 of 65. So we will have to make some choices here. But in these 7 chapters, I look at some exploratory research around the material histories of radical transparency before the digital age. Then I go into the kind of theories I use to bring about this better prism, this way of understanding what this is an instance of. And then I go into the new kind of empirical work around the digital age. So Wikileaks, after Wikileaks, and some institutions of radical transparency that actually stuck around. So I think, yeah, this exploratory research in chapter 1, which I kind of chart an empirical history of radical transparency, was a lot of fun because I got to look at, firsthand secondary sources, but letters between historical figures, the autobiographies, newspapers, microfilm, and Harvard stacks, right? It was this great kind of, research. I felt like a historian, which I'm not, so I've probably done a poor job. But I came to the conclusion that these guys were, doing the WikiLeaks things before there was WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks had nothing on these guys right here. And we may remember, the historians or political scientists around us may recall the Sykes-Picot agreement that was leaked or became very interesting for the international relations community. But this is only one of many, many leaked treaties that really upended discussions at the end of the First World War that were put into public purview for the first time by Lenin and Trotsky in just after the revolution. And it really changed how the high politics of democratic craft was processed. And we'll talk about that in a second. I dug back a little bit more though, and I found some really interesting insights as well. In this extraordinary story of the radical creation of Hansard, that simple record of parliament that Westminster-based democracies take for granted, actually had this really explosive start that you can read about in the first few pages of my book. But it involves the mayor of London being locked up in the Tower of London in contempt of parliament for protecting publishers that were stealing secrets and publishing them. The secrets that were in question were actually just what members of parliament were saying in the House of Commons. What members of parliament said in the House of Commons used to be protected. It was illegal to publish them. Anyways, this research was a lot of fun, and I came to try to systemize what I was looking at by observing instances of radical transparency in terms of context, methods, and effects. And from this kind of mix of context, methods, and effects, we could infer the type or paradigm of democracy that comes to be expected, right? That comes to be expected, and see how it's evolving. So we see in a Hansard debate publication, there's this kind of evolving, this is in 1771, there's an evolving idea of what intellectual property was. Printing presses were just, coming into the fore, and the idea of, how markets worked were just kind of happening. And this kind of pushed pushed along to have, a very unique effect, and worked in kind with a very specific paradigm of democracy, which we might identify as liberal. Lenin's open diplomacy was radically different. Obviously, there was different technology involved. We had telegraphs, we had national newspapers for the first time. There's this huge socio-political context of the cost of the war, right? All these secret treaties had not gone well for the major powers, the minor powers, etc. We had the Soviets, so these groups of people working together to try to overthrow the state. And all of these contexts, the methods that that were available in these contexts created a certain type of effect, right? And it had a paradigm of democracy that was unquestionably Marxist. And we can even see, we can see the intro to Das Kapital actually starts with, Marx wondering about where the transparency is in the factories of England, and why people aren't repulsed, right, by what they see, and then would be brought to revolution. So we see this mirrored in practice and put to practice. Of course, we don't remember open diplomacy that way. We in the West remember the leaked treaties and Wilson's 11-point response to the end of the war very differently. We had this idea of public diplomacy and the inclusion of new actors into this debate around international politics. And with it, I argue, we can observe some deliberative tendencies to this new form of open diplomacy that just didn't exist in high politics before, right? Democracy was for local issues, not for international. So this is kind of interesting. These are some of the microfilms I found, but these are how the newspapers of the time displayed the secret treaties. Excuse me. And we see, there's in the kind of cutout boxes, we see actual text from the actual treaties, and then editorialization around them, the maps of what each treaty was talking about and to whom. We get these really kind of unique quotes, right? So this is the editor of a newspaper in the UK writing in 1918 that says, we're writing about these things and giving it the greatest possible publicity, because in a country boasting itself a democracy and claiming to be fighting for democratic ends, they're just coming out of the war, remaining ignorant of these concealments is absurd as it is dangerous, right? So this is the kind of language we see to describe what's going on. Interestingly, when we think about, showing the actual text documents and these maps and these kind of things, it's not so far, and it kind of parallels some of the ideas around scientific journalism that Julian Assange came to expect from organizations over 100 years later. So what are we to make of these radically different interpretations and actions put to transparency in each of the specific contexts explored? These moments of radical transparency in history refract multiple hues of transparency as it is mediated through various social technical contexts. The light of the transparency ideal is refracted through material context to produce governmental consequence. In this way, my exploratory research suggests transparency is a technology of governing that produces a range of mechanisms to manage the expectations of conducting conduct across a spectrum of political assumptions. Now, my second chapter, I kind of double down into that argument in the theoretical sense, offering that increasing transparency leads to movements both away from secrecy and laterally across political planes. To do so, I surveyed the literatures of the ideal of transparency from government and political sciences, which really suggested to me that studies of transparency rarely incorporate communications and media studies perspectives. And I thought this is pretty odd because all transparency is mediated, right? It's not broadcast through a void. There are apparatuses, as we've seen already in the historical work, that create specific forms of information disclosure and how they're accessible and what we can do with them. And I think I will just breeze through this, but I basically bring in two main theorists at this point to help me discuss this. One is Foucault, of course, right? And the other is Wilhelm Flusser, which is probably not of a course. But two words that kept on coming up in the work I was looking at was apparatus and from Foucault, and design, how Wilhelm Flusser talked about design. So apparatus Foucault just gives this very kind of like technical understanding of in one of his works anyways, how we can think about what an apparatus is and the kind of component parts. And then Wilhelm Flusser speaks about how design is a tragic process. And I think the key just to take away here is I use Flusser's conception of design to understand what happens to ideals is they materialize in mediated forms. So the key to understanding is that the key to understanding what I'm trying to get across here is that media apparatuses deform the ideal of transparency in their mediated material practices. Or alternatively, apparatuses form an idea of transparency in mediated material practice. As I said before, we cannot really live outside a mediated world, so it's crucial to consider how socio-technological relations of power enact government. And here I'm interested in the government that is enacted through and with transparency. And so the picture I've selected here, right, is the panopticon, but this is just one form of understanding what increased visibility is for and what it forms, right? That's to say, like, how visibility comes to be managed and manages us is a process that is dependent on context, the technologies we use, and what we're then able to do with them. So I thought about this a lot, and I've relied on a lot of people, but this is the theory chapter that my publisher probably wished I deleted. So I'm just gonna continue on, because let's talk about WikiLeaks. That's why we're here, right? At least where we're starting to be here. And my basic thesis on WikiLeaks is this: it wasn't monolithic. Right? So this first chapter of WikiLeaks takes the logic I've thought about transparency, all the kind of refractions, the different hues that exist, the political hues that exist, and applies that to wikileaks.org. This chapter tells that story through WikiLeaks' birth, growth, and the mutations in terms of both its media apparatus and its democratic design, which I argue are linked. And while acknowledging how divisive figures like Assange and then even Trump shaped the narrative, my focus is on how the design choices of wikileaks.org offered a specific shape to why secrets were mediated to the public as they were, and what democratic consequences these crafted and the paths they left behind. So just some clip art for you on that. Here's an example. Here's the wiki of WikiLeaks. It's editable, sorry, it's not edible, it's editable, but it's also organized in a way that split the public into 4 distinct groups, 4 distinct elements, right, that could interact with WikiLeaks. There were truth tellers, editors, there's truth tellers who were the leakers, there's editors to help with analysis, there's volunteers for money, for donations and site upkeep, and visitors, which were basically journalists, described as journalists looking for resources, right, stories. And it's kind of interesting because the editor's portal contained guides on writing and researching, as well as the instructions on how to use truth over spin to, I quote, achieve maximum political impact, because that's what WikiLeaks was about, achieving maximum political impact through a wiki of truth. Until they weren't. And we have this shift, right, to this editorialization of truth. Here's an example of a markedly different design experience, and one that I would argue made WikiLeaks quite infamous. It was the leaked gun site video, right, that was editorialized as Collateral Murder and editorialized through collateralmurder.com. And basically, for those who haven't seen it or forget, it's a Apache helicopter gun site video of collateral murder that included an epigraph from George Orwell, this kind of humanizing text that hovers over the victims, closed captioning of the radio military chatter from the pilots that's pretty crass, and visual highlights toward the civilians, including children that were shot and killed. Or I think the children were rescued, I forget, I'm sorry. As well as the official kind of non-responses to the event. Here again, we have a different term, right? This is kind of the contractual work that WikiLeaks did with major news outlets that we see, that I think it was The Guardian, or yeah, it was The Guardian that called the War Diaries, and the New York Times, right, called the War Logs. The Guardian called them the War Logs as well. I think it was Wall Street Journal that was War Diaries. Anyways, this shows a different kind of phase that WikiLeaks existed in, and we remember the Cablegate, right? The cables that it shared with NYT and their other partners. So I came to see kind of 4 different design phases of WikiLeaks that I became interested in, significant iterations of wikileaks.org from 2006 to 11. And I'll come back to talk about it as kind of a coda, and WikiLeaks returned to publication by actively hacked leaks around 2012 through to the 2016 election, when the FSB or GRU elements kind of entered WikiLeaks design. But anyways, the argument is that each phase develops discrete affordances with specific democratic potentials. Again, moving not only away from secrecy, but sideways on this distinct political plane. So here is just a chart. And look, I've actually copied the PDF from my own book, which is like the first time I've been able to do that, which is pretty nice. But anyways, so we have our 4 phases, right? The wiki phase, this kind of public diplomacy phase, the editorial phase, and the contractual phase. And it gets a little hairy here, but I'll point out that in the public diplomacy phase, we have a lot of kind of like on-ground interactions going on. We can think of the work that WikiLeaks did with and in people in Kenya, right? And the kind of reports that were coming out at that time. Anyways, these elements and the design of them had specific affordances or opportunities, right? Option actions for the design of the democracy, a democratic practice WikiLeaks was trying to prosecute. This, of course, paints transparency in very unique lights, each of them. They're all, I would argue, distinct from each other, and they do distinct in different things, and speak to different designs of democracy. And I've kind of worked through in this chapter how I argue for each of these making sense, because some of them seem to be a little contrarian at first glance. I did say I'd mention, I'm just looking at the time, I did say I mentioned the kind of Russian story, and I think
Luke's on
I will.
Luke's on a Zoom call. Live Zoom.
There we go. But in the lead up to the 2016 presidential election, it published material that was stolen, WikiLeaks did, by the Russian state from the Democratic National Committee and candidate Clinton. Yeah, this information was widely seen in America to be detrimental to the Clinton campaign, and the disclosures were spoofed by the 2016 Republican presidential candidate, pictured, not going to say his name, over 160 times in interviews and campaign rallies. He mentioned the leaks and how great they were in all 3 of the televised debates in 2016. And this, of course, reflects a leaking of this material from the GRU, right, a Russian organ of state, to actually try to throw a democratic process. So it's kind of an interesting situation that we've now come to in the WikiLeaks story, and one that I can explain only through talking about life after WikiLeaks. In the book, I kind of talk about life after WikiLeaks as it leapt from obscurity to the nightly news. I argue that digital leaking underwent a short-lived Cambrian explosion of leak sites, and that there's just this kind of ecology of public leak sites, that sprung up. And I was interested in their practices in the period that WikiLeaks was popular. And I should point out that for all the leak sites I was looking at, each instance considered here, I should say, purports a similar basic form and ethos to the WikiLeaks model, which is, as I understand it, we publish anonymously uploaded secrets, right, or the uploaded secrets of others. And I must say that many of the apparatuses employed unique designs to afford a spectrum of political potentials and different democratic merits or lack of democratic merit. And the work in this chapter really takes a macro view of these experiments to show how the explosion and collapse of material practices of radical transparency inspired by WikiLeaks evolved. So I've done this in a few different ways. To decipher the more than 90 applicable websites in the relevant timeline, which is around 2006 to 2014, the chapter codes each for form and function in relation to the content, the capability, and the connections between the sites that existed.
Hi, this is
Hi. Oh, I'll meet you. Maybe I'll just ask if everyone can mute. There's been a little bit of chatter. So if you can just mute yourself, that would be fantastic. Thank you all. So anyways, as you can see from my waterfall chart here, I also kind of coded on capability, and I measured it through levels of anonymity and encryption that each site purported to offer, as well as its efficacy, if any, of publishing a leak. And it was pretty interesting to say, and I did that, just to see if there was, they purported to have a Tor service, which of course not only anonymizes you, but, not only secures and encrypts your transmission, but anonymizes and tries to obfuscate who you are, where you are. So it's kind of a double-blind communication you're having. And then, yeah, I mean, the results were interesting in that the sites that emerged varied in quality and longevity of their life, but only 24 of the 90 purported to have published a new leak of some kind and provided, some kind of reasonable evidence, whether on current web pages or looking through the Internet Archive around whether that happened or not. 1/4 of the sites had no instructions or methods for uploading leaks at all, and another quarter employed full encryption and offered users full Tor hidden service. So, I mean, there was just a wide variety of the kind of technical capacities of these sites to function. Interestingly to me, and we did just a very kind of basic thematic analysis, these are the themes that evolved in terms of what the content was about. There's a few called the first derivatives that basically just reframed WikiLeaks data in new ways, whether that was new ways to search or new ways to annotate or whatever, right? But they redid WikiLeaks' own work. There's a few that offered leaks as a service. We know some of them still exist, some of them still don't, but this was this kind of, plug and play leaks. Then there was a response from, major media and journalists that existed that were trying to kind of cash in or at least follow the bleeding edge here and have their own re-centralizing leaked services or sites that would come back and allow this form of disclosing information to be cycled back through the mainstream media, quote unquote. There's also 16 new ones, I would say, and I say new ones because they're kind of a shift of model that tried to actually redefine what was going on, and these were all quite interesting. There were a lot of mimics, and when I say mimics, what I mean here is it looked a lot like WikiLeaks, except maybe it was only about a certain issue, or except maybe it was only about a certain area, right? So we had university leaks, for instance, or we had Balkan leaks. I think we still do. So there's various, right, like kind of more focused sites of the same thing. 26 sites that I didn't look at for a variety of reasons, right, Monique, is there was the governments around the world actually set up sites that were asking for secrets to be leaked, but it was this really kind of ironic moment because these material would have obviously not be made public, right? This was like giving secrets to the secret keepers, which was kind of interesting from my perspective. So these are the kind of themes that evolved from the sites that evolved out of WikiLeaks, even though they didn't last very long. I think I'll skip these slides, sorry to say. If the last chapter was about the seemingly nasty, brutish, and short lives of radical transparency apparatuses after WikiLeaks and that most died out, I do note that some did not, right? Some seem to have sustained new forms of democracy or at least are still experimenting with them, where radical disclosure of secrets continues to be explored by actors that are transgressing traditional institutions of power via leaks or hacks or otherwise. And looking forwards, we might even claim that cultures of disclosing the data of others have proliferated after WikiLeaks in ways that have evolved past the original elements or design goals that WikiLeaks had. So we have cultures of digital leaking might now be viewed as a kind of ambient proto-institutional logic that defines common practices for hackers, companies, and governments that would otherwise have kept such data for themselves. So here I just want to talk about two examples or two specific cases of this kind of phenomenon. And yeah, those two cases are the ICIJ and the Anon leaks. So the ICIJ, the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, showed how the logic of distributed digital leaks can branch and sustain new forms of transparency. And for those unfamiliar with the ICIJ, it's a network of journalists, hundreds of them at this point, 100 and some, I should say at this point, from around the world. And they all work together to discern large leaked data sets or public data sets. And through their work together, make local stories, makes news stories that matter to certain locations. Some of these stories are interest to publics, some of them are interest to states, right? The ICIJ has done a lot of work around tax evasion. You've probably seen an ICIJ story about the Panama Files, the Paradise leaks, whatever, but any kind of tax haven related story, millionaire dodges tax, et cetera, in the last 10 years, it's probably come from the ICIJ. So they're around and they're using radical transparency in a new way to garner public attention and push real issues of disclosure back to states that can prosecute, right? The pointy end of the kind of coercion stick. The other example I wanted to share with you today was Anon leaks, and it serves as a foil to the ICIJ. And then it was, so if we're familiar with Anonymous, which is a group of anonymous hackers, this was Anonymous's foray into publishing leaks through a website they called, you guessed it, Anon leaks. And something that turned into Paranoia, which we'll talk about in a second. But one of the cases I cover for Anon leaks was when they hacked a security company called HB Gary and basically opened its secrets to the world. This would be all their emails, et cetera, right? They posted them. You can see just on the left here, they had all their emails posted. Now, publicly, so people could troll through them. The HB Gary revelations that were posted were taken up by journalists and reported on by papers of records, such as the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal. And as the reports surfaced, the interconnected web of security firms and law offices and even the US Chamber of Commerce quickly and quite publicly severed ties with HB Gary because HB Gary was doing some nasty stuff. As a result, HB Gary and its sister company closed up shop, right? It no longer existed. And this is really interesting because on one level, these results put into material practice Assange's original kind of philosophical treatise from 2006 around leaking, where he suggests that massive leaking actually cuts ties between conspirators to the extent that conspiracy proves ineffective and then just dissolves. And we might have seen that happen maybe in this instance. That being said, hacking into a company and making everything they do public is a radically aggressive nature of a radically aggressive example, I should say, of inciting transparency, and it positions this practice is positioned far outside any previous expectations of governing. This act of attack really spoke to libertarian anarchistic presumptions of where transparency not only produces autonomy, right, through allowing us to do things, but also disabling other people having voice by shutting down HB Gary. So it was really far out there. Just really quickly on the paranoia bit, interestingly, this practice tried to institutionalize itself. A group of the anonymous hackers reconfigured their digital resources and community to form a new entity that was called Potentially Alarming Research Anonymous Intelligence Agency, or Paranoia. And what was interesting is that members of Paranoia sought to separate the publishing and hacking aspects that were kind of governing their work, yet they also explicitly relied on material that was hacked from members of the anonymous hacking community. They claimed to, in other words, they claimed to be a public publisher, but as far as I could tell during that time, they actually didn't offer a public upload function, right? For leaks, they wanted hackers to contact them in different ways. And I think actually what I'll do is we might end it off here by just pointing out that new actors online are keeping this kind of work alive. The distributed denial of secrets, which is kind of like an internet, pun, I suppose. Keep this type of leak publication alive by claiming to be agnostic to where data sets come from, but understanding the need to publish them regardless. So their website is just about publishing these data sets that are leaked or stolen or hacked or whatever. They think that they basically have some criteria, right? And their criteria, which is up on the screen there, is, is it in the public interest? And can a prima facie case be made for the veracity of its contents? Meaning, is it true, right? And their motto, if you will, seems to be, we embrace all sources of information, but our mission is to know the truth, though the heavens may fall and the world may burn. And they say it in Latin, but that was their spokesman's translation of it. And this form of transparency, I mean, I guess we'll end here, but this form of transparency is adversarial, right? In to say the least, and it operationalizes the ideal of transparency into something that doesn't look democratic the most, but pushes the boundaries of what may be so. And I just like to maybe end off then by saying, remember that in 1770, parliamentarians could say anything parliamentarians could say in the House of Commons could be said in secrecy, with mayors and journalists jailed for thinking otherwise. And we've come thus far. So I'll skip through a couple funny stories about Iceland and some future-oriented work that you can ask me about to say to try to tie it all together. I really tried to build a case towards how extraordinary moments of transparency built by renegade, revolutionary, and otherwise outsider media apparatuses have shifted the course of democracy. And my focus on radical transparency showed how new forms of media disclose and disseminate information to pull away from current standards of secrecy. But it also recognized that disclosure is an inherently political act. Each new light of transparency breaks up the darkness in its own political hue. While transparency scholarship and studies of government often hide any political design found in the light of transparency, the work here embraced political intricacies for what they are and what they mean for democratic practice. In short, I use transparency as a least likely case to observe irreducible political differences in democratic practice. And I think that these differences do not only mean difference of opinion on policy outcomes or resource distribution, right, of who gets what. The differences speak to more fundamental concerns of the democratic project. They suggest a continually agonistic presentation of what transparency is and does, and what democracy can and should be. I view radical transparency as a prism that makes hegemonic political assumptions visible in the light. It refracts the expectations of sunlight into hues of its own political makeup. Radical transparency cracks open the light and makes its own politics visible, its power knowable, and its design changeable. So thank you very much.
I stop sharing. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Luke. Any questions? Yes, Monique? Or
I was just applauding Luke.
Sorry.
I don't run away.
Okay.
Endless applause instead of questions. That's fine, Monique.
Yes, Stephen.
Thanks, Luke. That was really, really interesting. I think it's really, obviously, a really fascinating topic. I've got a few little questions, little things that hopefully they can push a bit further on a few things. One thing I'm interested to see is your position on Assange and Wikileaks, is whether they're journalists or whether they're activists. Because obviously this is something that's, of course, legally important to Assange in some ways, but also politically really important, I think, about how we think about that divide in an era where the lines are blurring in so many different ways in the media space you're speaking about. The second question is really about whether Assange and WikiLeaks goes beyond transparency in their agenda. I always remember Assange early on was talking about how he didn't want to just sort of open the windows. He wanted to throw sand in the wheels of the particularly American policymaking machine. I'm wondering whether this pushes, I mean, it's radical, but it's radical in a way that's not, in some ways it's not democratic. I just want to sort of push a bit further on that question of whether we can think about Assange in how we think about his radical agenda rather than just whether or not he is a radical. And the last sort of question really for me is a sort of consequence of what you're talking about whether the WikiLeaks phenomena and the other ones that you talked about, which I think are really good. I think the ICIJ one is a really, really powerful example of activism, disclosing whistleblowing type of stuff that's going to lead to policy change, or it's helping policy change. But the question for me is whether, when you have a high-profile example like Assange and some of the other people being caught up in that kind of situation in the last 10 years, whether this leaking provokes a backlash where it actually makes disclosure and open government more difficult. And just one little example I think might fit into this is the way in which some of the embarrassing things that came out of diplomatic cables from WikiLeaks, which are really low priority in the diplomatic information chain. But it's already been said that the diplomats are now being far more careful about what they put into cables because they don't want it to be embarrassing to their government. So whether this whistleblowing provokes a response which undermines the transparency that you're pointing to. But thank you for a great presentation.
So thank you for all three questions. I think they're all not only completely valid but really interesting for myself. So I'd love to try to dig into them. Maybe I'll work backwards on that. So I mean, I agree with you completely that it's such a shame, and yet all too predictable when what Merkel ate for breakfast was like the headline, right? And so you get this gossip that's the headline from the cables, and does that make transparency more difficult because politicians become more closed off? And I think there's some real validity to that, right? So even with the case of Hansard, of what was secret in Parliament no longer being secret, we now have cabinet incompetence. Right, we just take it to cabinet, go away, and there's heaps of administrative literature, right, of governance literature that says like, all the work can only be done in these secret spaces, and there's lots of transparency literature that says that too, can only be done in the secret spaces, because there's a difference between transparency of process and a transparency of results or whatever, right? So there's definitely the argument to say, look, you need to hash it out in secret and then tell everyone about it, and this far and no further. And breaches of that contract, right, definitely produce more secrecy or more want for secrecy. Absolutely. Do I think that that's a winning argument? I'm a bit more radical in the sense that I say I don't think it is. I think in the long game it is not, right? So you do have these reactions, but it continues to be a movement that is untenable, and it's just tied to the ability of information to move, basically. So maybe that's a cop-out around the kind of high profile leaks making open government more difficult. Sand in the gears, Assange, what he's doing beyond transparency. I think this is a really, really difficult question, and I don't know how to answer it. And I think it's easy to say it is beyond transparency in a normatively negative sense, because sorry for those people who know him better than me, but he doesn't seem like a very nice guy, right? And because of that, it's easy for us to make that argument. It's an easy argument to make. A similar argument was made about Brass Crosby and his friend John Wilkes, because like John Wilkes was a real jerk and would just like spout off in Parliament and thought that he was a bit of a weird dude, to be honest, right? Some great insight into what he was up to. Anyways, they changed democracy in a really fundamental way, even though people thought it was what they were doing was beyond transparency. They were doing something that was undemocratic at the time. And then our views of that shifted. And that's why I think it's a really hard question to answer. And that's why I don't purport to know it, but I'm aware that it has happened before. And then the first question, activist or journalist? This is the one that I it's rightly or wrongly, I kind of love to tee up to my American friends, because there's this sense that journalists are impartial and observe the facts and then report them. And I don't share that view. I don't see how that's possible. I think this idea of impartiality and objectivity in creating news is a modern fiction, and like a fiction of modernity, right? That's being created in a specific set of circumstances that is like worked pretty well, to be honest. I'm not saying, it's worked pretty well when it needed to work. But there's these really kind of specific assumptions around how politics works that exists in that space. And it exists in that space from, like, let's say, sorry, I'll just ask for a mute. But it exists in that space from kind of like the 1940s onward. I'm gonna find you, person who's not muted. It kind of just, it exists in the space from the, like, post-World War II era, at least farther back, but you just look at the American scholarship that comes out around what journalism is. And you don't see that the whole way through. Journalists were advocates, they were activists, and they were like, the London Herald was like a labor publication, right? It was like union rah rah rah. The the like Pravda, right? It was Pravda. Like it wasn't this myth of impartiality and objectivity is a thing that existed for a moment. And that served democracy well for that moment. But I think we should also be careful understanding that it was a construction of transparency for a time and place, and it might change. So that's how I tee it up for my American friends. But I am, Fan, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I'm happy to ask a question if time allows. Thanks, Luke. Thanks for the talk. I'm interested to know more about the unequal distribution of transparency and democracy, especially in terms of, transparency can be located on specific issue and can be located on specific regions. And I think one way to, the reason that I asked the question was I saw in one of your slides about distributed denial of secrets. There's a point of the definition of public interest. So I'm just wondering how public interest is defined by across those different sites, and whether those different sites they have, or different disclosure networks, they have different aspects or focus covered in their disclosure. So yeah.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. So I mean, there's a few axes on that, right? And the first, like, for better or worse, it was very, the work I did was very tied to Westminster Parliament, right? So the Western side of things. But then second, it was interesting to me, as this kind of transparency ecosystem exploded, radical transparency leak sites exploded. It seemed like some of that was kind of self-organizing, and not to get all like, networky or whatever, but it was interesting to see what became transparent and what didn't, right? So at the time, does that doesn't answer your question very well, but I hear what you're saying, and it was interesting to see that there was specific areas or interests that would blow up, and there was others like climate change that just wouldn't, right? So I don't know why or how, but that's definitely a factor that exists, like a question mark.
Thanks, Luke.
Yeah.
Hi, Luke. Thank you for your wonderful talk. I wonder whether you can talk about your views about how does this radical transparency impact the idea of radical democracy. So what kind of, how does this radical transparency open up a new possibility of a kind of a radical democracy? That if I put it in the concrete way, how does this modify, challenge existing electoral democracy or deliberative democracy or monetary democracy?
Yeah, no, thank you so much. Thank you so much for that, because I mean, in all honesty, thank you for asking the thesis of my thesis, right? And I think I answer it this way. So my first thesis, and my first, the observation is that the transparency I observed was radically diverse, right? We had these moves to deliberative, I'll call it deliberative transparency. We had these moves to like a very kind of market-based, vote counting transparency. There was all these like very specific moves. And my interpretation of that is observing that there is, in fact, in practice, this diversity that exists, okay? And it's not going away. So when I look at radical democracy, my suggestion for radical democracy is that theories of agonism must accept that there will be agonism within agonism, meaning that you will have moments when there are adversarial projects going on, and this is good for democracy. You will have moments where it seems that you are in a collaborative Habermasian understanding of what is happening. And it's this adversarial respect and engagement with all of that is what kind of allows those two observations to exist together. So yes, democracy will be adversarial in terms of the theory behind it, but because of that, you also have to acknowledge you will have these collaborative moments where everything seems to be very deliberative in an old-fashioned sense. I hope that answers your question a little bit. And
but if that is the case, so that does not undermine the existing form of democracy. Kind of liberal democracy largely is adversary. It's also a collaborative game. So if you answer in this way, so there's no radical democracy there. So just I wonder, just because your research indicates something new there, but exactly how exactly can impact on democracy? I found this fascinating. This is the question.
and I think it's really interesting because there's kind of like, so my understanding is there's kind of the Chantal Mouffe and her co-conspirators, if you will, right over here. But then there's this this researcher called Winnenbach out of the States, and he's just like a little bit back that says, he pulls it a little bit back towards a more deliberative stance of radical democracy, and it's this really interesting kind of half move, half tick back, and I think that's closer to where the answer is. And I'll actually forward you the work because it's really neat.
I think maybe this radical transparency really offer concrete institutions, is what you just said in your discussion, this open institution that will strengthen monetary democracy. But hardly they can challenge the electoral democracy.
I think it challenges it by being open to something challenging it, being open to something else coming.
Yeah, but
right?
Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, okay. Thank you. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Have we got time for any more?
Yes, one more.
Anyone who needs or wants to leave, please feel free. But Tanya, I'd love to hear.
Luke, I've got lots of things to ask and lots of things to talk to you about, but I suppose what I'm struck by is and I suppose it's not a direct question. I don't want to ask it in a way that says, why didn't you write the book that I wanted you to write? Which I hate that. I hate that question. But I'm really genuinely wanting to hear your perspective on how your research kind of pivots into this other side of challenging democracy, which is about, taking that which is incredibly visible, like it's open, it's right there, it's concrete. Like every time we turn on the TV, we see these policies and behaviours of not just politicians, but big corporations in Australia and around the world, behaving in a way that is questionable, and it's framed by a certain kind of logic of behaviour that's largely, colonial and Western, and part of the trouble, like part of the challenge of combating that, or even kind of making that visible enough to see, is to raise the consciousness of people to the point where they see that which is in front of them as being something other than natural and normal and normative, something that is subjective and built through history and power relations and all of those other things that, us nerds like to study. So what is that relationship? I suppose, can you characterize or reflect on that relationship between the task, as I see it, of making that which is concrete visible, or problematizing that which is right in front of us and seemingly, natural, and the task of presumably, digging up and uncovering and revealing. It's almost performative, and Assange, I think, is a great sort of trope for this, because he plays that part so beautifully. But I what can you say about that? I'd be interested to know.
I mean, that's a tough one, and it's interesting you point that out. I mean, one of the weaknesses of the book, or something I didn't write on, was the politicians, right?
You can't write everything. You can't write everything in one book, right?
And that's it. And Assange is not in the book. He's just not. I mean, he is, because I didn't know I was talking to him when I was talking to him. But for all intents and purposes, he's not in the book. And the reason that is I was focused on the kind of the apparatus, right? This like media, digital, right, political thing that exists that the person is absent from in a lot of respects, to the detriment of the methodology. So good question. But I think, I mean, I don't know. It's interesting how you phrased it at the end there for me, because when you say, when we look at the normative behavior of these politicians doing what they're doing and trying to make that visible in a new way for what it is or something, that to me kind of is the transparency bit, right? It is like breaking that light of what's happening into like what's actually happening. So I think, how do we do that institutionally? Well, it's interesting. I mean, there are really boring ways to do that. I have an American colleague who was like, "Hey, do you Australians like have a government accountability office where you just like instantly put up all the tenders and funds out of government to all the consultants that you use like the day you do it?" I was like, "What?" Right? So I mean, there's these like that to them is just like second nature. It happens. So there's these like really boring kind of ways that you can run your institutions to make that kind of stuff visible. That's just like it's just a policy choice. But then how that becomes made normal or interesting for media in terms of the audiences that consume it. I don't know. So I'm sorry, it's a poor answer to your question, but it's definitely an interesting one that like
I don't know either. Like I'm just I think it's fascinating. I'd love to talk about it more.
Thank you so
much. Great book.
Liz.
Congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
Congratulations on the book again, and thank you so much, Luke, and thank you to everybody who has come and participated in a discussion around Luke's amazing book. I actually have a question, Luke, but I won't keep everyone from their lunch, I'm just going to mail you my question.
Sure.
So we'll just take it onto the email. So thank you so much again, Luke. Congratulations.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for your time. Again, at this time of year, great discussion, everybody.
Absolutely.
And
thank you all very much for coming.
Our next talk is by Dr. Stephen Slaughter on the 15th of November. It's exactly in a fortnight. And that's going to be about a book in progress. And I love books in progress. So I'm really looking forward to that. See you, everybody. See you in a fortnight.
Take care. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.